The warm cascade of water from the shower head was the only sound in the bathroom that afternoon. Marlene leaned her head back, letting the steady stream wash over her face, as if it could rinse away the invisible weight she carried. The sun outside cast golden streaks through the frosted glass, creating patterns on the tiled walls, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, she felt a fleeting sense of calm. It was rare for the house to feel so tranquil, unburdened by the usual demands of daily life, and she allowed herself to savor the moment. Her thoughts wandered, drifting from mundane concerns to the quiet loneliness that had begun to define her life. Robert, her husband, was often away, work trips, business dinners, endless excuses. He was a good man, dependable, but absent in ways that mattered most. The spaces he left behind felt cavernous, and Marlene often found herself filling the silence with her own restless thoughts. She ran her hands through her damp hair, letting the heat of the water loosen the knots in her shoulders. The rhythm of the droplets against the porcelain tub was soothing, almost hypnotic. But then, faintly, a sound disrupted the peace. A creak. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to pull her from her thoughts. Her hand froze mid-motion as her ears strained to catch another noise. Maybe it was the house settling, she told herself. This old place always had its quirks. And then it came again, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. Her pulse quickened as she turned her head toward the bathroom door, the haze of tranquility evaporating in an instant. She was about to call out when the door handle twisted sharply. The door opened, and there he was. Kaden. Her breath caught in her throat. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space as sunlight haloed his figure. His expression shifted rapidly from shock to something unreadable. Marlene instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, though the frosted glass of the shower door obscured her from view. Still, she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her state of undress. "And Marlene," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the spray of water. "I didn't know you were here." It's fine," she managed to say, though her voice was shaky, uncertain. "Just close the door." But he didn't move immediately. His hand lingered on the doorknob, his knuckles white as if he were gripping it too tightly. His gaze flickered downward briefly before snapping back to meet hers. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the charged silence between them. Finally, he muttered an apology under his breath and stepped back, pulling the door shut with a quiet click. Marlene exhaled a shaky breath, her palms pressing against the cool tile of the shower wall. Her heart was racing, her thoughts a chaotic swirl. Why hadn't she reacted differently? Why had she frozen like that? And why, despite the embarrassment of the situation, did she feel something else, something far more confusing? The way he had looked at her lingered in her mind, not just with surprise, but with an intensity that sent an unexpected shiver through her. Stepping out of the shower, she wrapped herself in a towel and faced the mirror. The reflection staring back at her felt unfamiliar. Her dark hair clung to her damp skin, her cheeks still flushed from more than just the heat of the water. She ran a hand over her collarbone, tracing the droplets that clung there, and tried to shake the thoughts threatening to take root. Dinner that evening was an exercise in restraint. Robert was home, seated at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone between bites of roast chicken. Kaden sat across from Marlene, his eyes fixed on his plate, his movements stiff and deliberate. The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken weight that neither dared to acknowledge. Marlene forced herself to engage in trivial conversation with Robert, nodding and smiling at his recounting of yet another business meeting. All the while, she was acutely aware of Kaden's presence, of the way his gaze occasionally flickered toward her before darting away. Afterward, as she cleared the table, she felt him pass behind her, his proximity making her skin prickle. He didn't say anything, but the air seemed to thicken in that brief moment, charged with something she couldn't name. The clinking of dishes in the sink felt deafening in the quiet of the kitchen, and she busied herself with the task, hoping to steady her thoughts. That night, as Marlene lay in bed beside Robert, listening to his steady breathing, she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the day. The moment in the bathroom loomed largest, every detail etched into her memory. She could still see the look in Kaden's eyes, hear the falter in his voice, feel the heat that had risen to her cheeks. She told herself it was nothing, an innocent mistake, a moment of awkwardness that meant nothing. But deep down, she knew better. Something had shifted, something she wasn't ready to confront. Sleep eluded her as questions swirled in the darkness. What did it mean? Why did it affect her so deeply? And what would happen if that fragile boundary between them continued to blur? The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating, leaving her restless as the hours stretched into the early morning. The next day, Marlene tried to return to normalcy, but the awkwardness clung to her like a shadow. Every interaction with Kaden felt loaded, as if the air around them was charged with unspoken tension. He avoided her gaze, his usual ease replaced with a quiet hesitance. She found herself watching him more than she should, her thoughts wandering to places they had no business going. By the time dinner rolled around again, the atmosphere in the house was stifling. Robert, ever oblivious, filled the silence with stories of his day, but Marlene could barely focus. Her mind was elsewhere, caught in the tangled web of her own emotions. When the meal was over and Robert retreated to his study, Marlene lingered in the dining room, her hands idly folding the napkins. Kaden was still there, sitting across the table with his glass of wine. He hadn't spoken much during dinner, but now he seemed reluctant to leave. Marlene hesitated in the doorway, torn between retreating upstairs and staying to address the unspoken tension that hung between them. "Do you want more?" she asked, gesturing to his glass. Her voice felt too soft, too uncertain. He shook his head, offering a faint smile. "No, I'm good." She nodded but didn't move to leave. Instead, she sat down across from him, the chair creaking faintly under her weight. The silence between them was heavy, laden with meaning neither dared to voice. "It's been a while since we've all had dinner together," she said finally, her tone light, almost conversational. "With Robert traveling so much, it feels rare these days." Kaden nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, it's nice." "Even if," he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the table. "Even if what?" she prompted, her heart giving a small, traitorous leap at his hesitation. He looked up then, his eyes meeting hers with startling intensity. "Even if it feels different." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Marlene's breath hitched, her mind racing as the fragile boundary between them began to fray even further. The stillness of the night had a way of amplifying everything, every creak of the house, every thought swirling in my mind, every unspoken word left hanging in the air between Kaden and me. I sat at the kitchen table, the tea mug in my hands no longer steaming, its warmth fading just as I felt my own resolve slipping. Kaden's words lingered, his soft but steady confession echoing in my ears. "I don't think I can forget it," he had said, and something about the way he looked at me made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain, or perhaps didn't want to. The moment hung heavy between us, like the atmosphere before a storm, electric and charged. I had wanted to push it away, to tell him it was nothing, just a mistake, a fleeting, awkward moment that meant nothing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It had meant something, even if I refused to admit it to myself. And now, sitting there with his gaze locked onto mine, I felt a pull I couldn't shake, an invisible thread binding us in ways it shouldn't. "Marlene," he said again, my name barely a whisper, yet it carried so much weight. I don't want to ruin anything, but I can't pretend either." His vulnerability disarmed me. It wasn't a practiced charm or calculated move. It was raw, unfiltered, and it reached places inside me I had long since buried. I tightened my grip on the mug, using its solidness to ground me, to tether me to something real. "You're not ruining anything," I lied, my voice trembling slightly. It's been a strange few days. That's all." But Kaden didn't look convinced. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing slow, absent patterns on the rim of his mug, as though he were trying to sort through his own tangled thoughts. "It doesn't feel like just a few strange days," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. It feels like something shifted. And I don't know what to do with that. Neither did I. The truth was, I felt the shift too. The dynamic between us had altered in ways that left me feeling unmoored, as though the ground beneath me had shifted without warning. I wanted to deny it, to dismiss it as some passing oddity, but I couldn't. Not when his words mirrored my own unspoken thoughts so perfectly. The silence between us stretched, and I could feel my resolve fraying with each passing second. When his hand reached out, tentative and unsure, I froze. His fingers brushed mine, lightly at first, as though testing the waters, and then, when I didn't pull away, he held on, his grip firm but gentle. The contact sent a shiver up my spine, one I couldn't suppress even if I tried. "Kaden," I whispered, his name catching in my throat like a secret I wasn't supposed to speak. Whatever this is, it can't happen." "I know," he said, his voice barely audible, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. "But that doesn't mean I can ignore it." My chest felt tight, my thoughts a chaotic mess. The weight of his words pressed against me, demanding something I wasn't sure I could give. How had we gotten here? How had we crossed a line that felt both invisible and impossible to return from? The distant chime of the clock broke the spell, grounding me in reality. I pulled my hand back, the loss of his touch leaving a strange emptiness in its wake. "I should go to bed," I said, rising from the table, my voice firmer than I felt. Kaden nodded, his eyes following me as I moved toward the doorway. "Good night, Marlene," he said softly, his words lingering in the air long after I'd left. Upstairs, the house felt quieter than ever, the stillness pressing in on me from all sides. I slipped under the covers, but sleep refused to come. My mind replayed every moment of the evening, every glance, every word, every fleeting touch. I couldn't escape it, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at me, the way his voice had carried an ache that mirrored my own. I turned onto my side, staring at the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. My heart felt heavy with questions I couldn't answer. Where was this heading? Could I stop it before it spiraled further out of control? And more importantly, did I even want to? The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving, and as I lay there in the dark, I knew one thing for certain. Something had changed between Kaden and me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pretend it hadn't. The boundary between us was fraying, unraveling with each passing day, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to hold it together. The stillness of the house seemed to mock me, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I realized with a sinking heart that this was only the beginning. The lines between us had blurred, and there was no going back to the way things had been. The house felt unnaturally quiet that evening, with Robert away on another business trip. The usual hum of his presence was absent, leaving behind an unsettling stillness. I sat on the back porch, a glass of wine in my hand, the soft golden light from the outdoor lamps casting long shadows across the wooden planks. The summer breeze carried a faint earthy scent, brushing against my skin like a whisper. It should have been peaceful, but restlessness gnawed at me, my thoughts a tangled mess I couldn't begin to unravel. Kaden was somewhere inside, his quiet presence filling the house in a way that felt almost palpable. Since that midnight conversation in the kitchen, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, the warmth in his gaze, the way my name had rolled off his tongue as if it carried weight. The thought unsettled me, and yet I couldn't deny the pull it had over me. The soft creak of the sliding door startled me, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see Kaden stepping onto the porch, a beer in one hand and his other casually tucked into his pocket. The dim light softened his features, making him look both familiar and unfamiliar at once. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, blending into the quiet of the night. I shook my head, offering a faint smile. "Just needed some air." He nodded, stepping closer and gesturing to the empty chair beside me. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course not," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. As he sat down, the space between us felt both too close and impossibly vast. The night wrapped around us, the fireflies in the distance flickering like forgotten stars. I traced the rim of my glass with my thumb, trying to calm the rhythm of my breathing, but the awareness of his presence consumed me. "You seem different when he's not here," Kaden said suddenly, breaking the silence. His words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. I turned to him, startled. "Different how?" He hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the yard. "I don't know. Lighter, maybe. Like you're more yourself." His observation hit me like a wave, leaving me momentarily speechless. I swallowed hard, looking away as heat crept up my neck. "That's not true," I said, though the words felt hollow, even to me. "It is," he insisted, his tone soft but resolute. "You deserve to be happy." The sincerity in his voice unraveled something inside me. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass as my pulse quickened. I wanted to respond, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned my gaze back to the yard, letting the silence stretch between us. Yet even in the quiet, his presence was inescapable, a current humming just beneath the surface. "You should go to bed," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. "So should you," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. But here we are. I couldn't help but laugh softly, shaking my head. His chuckle followed, warm and rich, sending a shiver through me I tried to ignore. I glanced over at him, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was something in his gaze that made my breath hitch, a vulnerability, a longing that mirrored my own. My carefully constructed walls began to crack. "Kaden," I began, but the words faltered, caught in my throat. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. I want you to know that I see you. I see how hard you try to hold everything together, how much you give to everyone else. But you deserve to have something for yourself, too." His words hit me with the force of a tidal wave, breaking through every defense I had left. My chest tightened as a tear slipped down my cheek, which I quickly wiped away. "Sorry," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "I didn't mean to get emotional." "You don't have to apologize," he said, his voice tender. "You don't always have to be strong." There was a kindness in his tone that made my heart ache, a warmth I hadn't realized I was starving for. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I allowed myself to see him, not as Robert's son, not as the boy I had watched grow up, but as a man. And that realization terrified me as much as it drew me in. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. My mind raced, a chaotic swirl of emotions and thoughts I couldn't untangle. Despite everything, a small, quiet part of me didn't want the moment to end. But it had to. I knew it had to. "I think I'll head to bed," I said finally, my voice barely audible. Kaden nodded, though his expression was unreadable. "Good night, Marlene." "Good night," I replied, though the word felt inadequate, too small to contain everything I was feeling. As I walked back into the house, I could feel his gaze on me, a weight that lingered long after I had disappeared up the stairs. I closed my bedroom door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My heart raced, my skin tingling with an awareness I couldn't ignore. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my mind. I couldn't stop wondering what would happen if I allowed myself to let go, to give in to the pull I felt every time I was near him. Most of all, I couldn't stop asking myself one question: what if this was only the beginning? The morning light filtered through the windows, casting a muted glow across the quiet kitchen. I stood alone by the counter, the cool surface grounding me as I cradled a mug of coffee. The house was still, except for the faint creak of the floorboards under my bare feet and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Robert had left early for a meeting, his absence leaving a void that felt heavier than usual. I hadn't seen Kaden yet this morning, and though I told myself I wasn't thinking about him, my thoughts betrayed me. The scrape of a chair startled me, and I turned to find Kaden standing in the doorway. His hair was tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a softness in his gaze that caught me off guard. "Morning," he said, his voice low and unhurried. He stepped into the kitchen, moving toward the coffee pot. "Robert gone already?" I nodded. "Meeting in the city." He won't be back until late. He poured himself a cup of coffee, leaning casually against the counter as he took a sip. The silence stretched between us, charged and fragile, like a thread pulled too tight. My grip tightened around my mug, and I avoided his eyes, focusing instead on the steam rising from the dark liquid. "You seem different when he's not here," Kaden said suddenly. His words made me look up, surprised. "Different how?" He hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window before returning to mine. "Lighter, maybe. Like you're more yourself." The observation hit me harder than I expected, leaving me momentarily speechless. I swallowed hard, forcing a faint laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. "That's not true," I said, but the words felt flimsy, insubstantial. Kaden didn't argue, but the way he looked at me made my chest tighten. He wasn't just seeing me, he was reading me, peeling back layers I hadn't even realized I'd built around myself. I turned away, desperate to escape the intensity of his gaze, and placed my mug down on the counter. "You deserve to be happy," he said softly, his voice carrying a sincerity that made my breath catch. I froze, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to respond, to dismiss his statement as misplaced, but I couldn't. My throat tightened, and the weight of his words settled over me like a burden I wasn't ready to confront. "Kaden," I began, my voice trembling. "We can't do this." He stepped closer, his presence a warmth that I could feel even before he touched me. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't change how I feel. Or how you feel." "This isn't right," I said, my words shaking under the weight of my emotions. "It doesn't matter how we feel. We can't do this. We'll ruin everything." His hand brushed against mine, a fleeting touch that sent a spark racing through me. I should have pulled away, should have put more space between us, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, caught between the pull of what I wanted and the weight of what I knew was right. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "But I can't pretend I don't feel this. Can you?" My breath hitched, and I closed my eyes, willing myself to find the strength to push him away. "I can't do this," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Please, Kaden. You need to go." There was a long pause, the silence between us stretching unbearably thin. Finally, he stepped back, the warmth of his presence retreating. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll go." I didn't look at him as he left. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed where I was, gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. When the sound of the door closing reached me, I let out a shaky breath, my shoulders slumping under the weight of everything I was feeling. The rest of the day passed in a blur, the house feeling impossibly empty despite its size. Robert returned late in the evening, his usual cheer filling the spaces that had felt so hollow. I forced myself to smile, to laugh at his stories about his meeting, to pretend that everything was normal. But the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, staring at the faint patterns of moonlight on the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about Kaden. About the way he'd looked at me, the way his words had cut through all my defenses. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering dangerously close to a fall I wasn't sure I could recover from. But for now, I told myself I had to hold on. To keep my balance, no matter how much the pull threatened to drag me over the edge. Because some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. And I wasn't ready to face what lay on the other side.